The cold marble walls of the courtroom stood tall and imposing, their silence broken only by the occasional murmur of those seated in the gallery. The air felt heavy, almost like it carried the weight of judgment itself. Wooden benches creaked softly under the shifting bodies of curious onlookers and concerned family members. A solemn clerk flipped through files at the front, her movements methodical, as if rehearsed 1,000 times. In the center, the raised bench loomed, empty for now but commanding attention, waiting for justice to take its seat. The smell of polished wood and aged paper filled the air, mingling with the tension that buzzed silently through the room. The bailiff called for silence, his voice firm but practiced. Conversations stopped instantly. Everyone turned toward the front as the courtroom doors opened with a deliberate creak. In walked Judge Richard Thompson, clad in a black robe that flowed with quiet authority. He climbed the steps to his bench and sat with a rigid posture. His face, carved with years of experience, revealed little emotion. Known throughout the city as a strict by-the-book judge, he had a reputation for delivering hard but fair sentences. He believed firmly in the law and rarely allowed emotion to influence his decisions. The courtroom stood still as the next case was announced. Case number 4267, the State versus Danielle Carter. A young black woman rose slowly from her seat at the defendant's table. She wore a plain white blouse and black slacks, her clothes neat but clearly worn. Her hands trembled slightly, though she tried to hide it. Her lawyer gave her a small nod of encouragement, but she didn't return it. Her eyes were fixed on the judge, her posture straight. There was a quiet strength in her, a readiness that didn't go unnoticed by those watching. Danielle Carter, just 24 years old, stood accused of shoplifting from a local grocery store. The incident had sparked debate across town, not because of the crime itself, but because of the circumstances surrounding it. According to police reports, she had stolen basic necessities, baby formula, diapers, bread, and canned goods. No weapons, no violence. A crime of desperation, some said. Others weren't so forgiving. She took a quiet breath as the clerk read out the charges. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Some in the courtroom had already made up their minds. Others watched with cautious curiosity. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at her, face unreadable. For Danielle, this moment felt like the edge of a cliff. She didn't know whether she was about to fall or fly. And as the courtroom settled once more into silence, all eyes were on her, waiting for what would come next. Judge Thompson cleared his throat and looked directly at Danielle. The room was silent, everyone waiting for his next words. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice firm and measured, "you are charged with petty theft under Section 484 of the Penal Code. How do you plead?" There was a brief pause. Danielle stood upright, her hands clenched at her sides. Her lawyer leaned in slightly, ready to respond on her behalf. But before he could say a word, Danielle spoke, her voice steady though quiet. "I'm guilty, Your Honor." A ripple of surprise swept through the courtroom. Gasps and whispers followed almost immediately. Even the stenographer hesitated for a moment before continuing her transcription. Danielle's lawyer turned toward her, eyes wide, his mouth slightly open. This wasn't the plan. They had agreed to plead not guilty and fight the charges based on lack of intent and financial hardship. But Danielle had just thrown that plan out the window. "Miss Carter," the judge said, clearly taken aback, "do you understand the consequences of pleading guilty today? Your attorney hasn't entered this plea. Are you certain about this?" "Yes, Your Honor," Danielle replied, her voice now a little stronger. "I understand. I want to take responsibility for what I did." Her lawyer leaned in urgently, whispering something to her, but Danielle gently shook her head. She wasn't being reckless. She wasn't trying to provoke sympathy. She simply wanted to own her actions. She turned to the judge again. "Your Honor, may I speak?" The judge studied her for a long moment. His eyes, sharp and calculating, searched her face for any sign of manipulation or false humility. He was used to defendants making last-minute plays for leniency, but there was something different about this young woman, something raw and sincere in her tone. He nodded slowly. "You may." Danielle took a breath, her fingers fidgeting slightly at her sides before she steadied herself. She glanced around the courtroom briefly, her gaze brushing past the disapproving stares and curious eyes. Then she looked back up at the judge. "I know what I did was wrong. I don't have a fancy excuse. I stole because I felt I had no choice. My siblings were hungry. The lights were out in our apartment. I couldn't pay for diapers. I was tired of watching my family suffer." Her voice didn't waver, but there was a weight behind every word, a truth that cut through the courtroom noise and silenced even the whispers. "I didn't come here to beg for mercy," she continued. "I came to be honest. I did it, and I'll accept the consequences. But I thought the court deserved to know why." The room had gone completely still again. Her confession wasn't just unexpected, it was disarming. For the first time in a long while, Judge Thompson felt something stir within him, and while his face gave nothing away, it was clear to all that Danielle's words had left an impression. Danielle took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice calm but heavy with emotion. She didn't need to raise her tone to capture the courtroom's attention. Every word landed with quiet power. She explained that she wasn't just looking out for herself. Since her mother passed away 2 years ago, she had become the legal guardian of her 2 younger siblings, ages 9 and 11. Their father had never been in the picture, and extended family offered little more than pity and empty promises. She was the only one standing between her siblings and the streets. She talked about working long hours at 2 different jobs, one at a diner during the day, and another as a cleaner at night. Most days, she only got a few hours of sleep. Still, the bills kept piling up. Rent was always late. The landlord had already delivered 2 eviction notices. The electricity had been shut off more than once, and food was becoming scarce. She described how on the day of the incident, her youngest brother had gone to bed crying from hunger, and the desperation she felt watching him suffer. She walked into the store that day, with one goal: to feed her family. It wasn't planned, it wasn't something she was proud of, but in that moment, the shelves full of food felt like her only option. "I know what I did was illegal," she said, "but I couldn't stand the thought of my siblings waking up hungry again." Danielle paused, her hands trembling slightly, though she kept her voice steady. "I'm not asking for sympathy," she added. "I'm just telling the truth. I didn't want to lie to this court, or pretend I was innocent. I made a choice, a bad one, but I made it because I didn't see any other way." Her words were plain, without drama or theatrics, but that honesty, that vulnerability, carried more weight than any polished speech could. People in the gallery looked down, some blinking away tears. Even the bailiff, who had seen countless trials, stood a little straighter, visibly moved. Danielle didn't cry, she didn't plead, she just stood there, raw and unfiltered, letting her truth fill the room. And in that moment, even those who had entered the courtroom ready to judge her, found themselves questioning what justice truly meant. Judge Richard Thompson had been on the bench for nearly 20 years, and in that time he had earned a reputation that reached far beyond the courtroom. He was known across the state as a man of unshakable principle, someone who valued the law above sentiment, facts above feelings. His courtroom was a place of order, precision and consequence. Lawyers prepared meticulously when arguing before him, knowing he had no patience for theatrics or excuses. His rulings were crisp, his demeanor cool, and his decisions often stern. He didn't believe in second chances, only in accountability. His strict approach had made headlines more than once. Stories of people leaving his courtroom in tears weren't uncommon. He had once sentenced a repeat offender to the maximum penalty for a series of petty thefts, despite the man's plea about a sick child at home. Emotion, Thompson had said, may move the heart, but it must not bend the law. That quote had been printed in a local newspaper, etched in people's minds as a symbol of his unwavering stance. But there was a reason behind that hardened shell. Many years ago, before becoming a judge, Richard had served as a prosecutor. In his early days, he had watched criminals walk free on technicalities and emotional appeals. A case involving the death of a child, where the accused was acquitted due to a lack of concrete evidence despite overwhelming suspicion, had left a deep scar on him. From then on, he resolved to never allow emotion to blur the lines of justice. He brought that same cold clarity to every case, whether it involved grand theft or a minor traffic violation. Thompson viewed the courtroom as sacred ground. The law was the law. It didn't bend for tears. It didn't soften for stories. And while that made him unpopular in some circles, it also made him respected. No one could ever accuse Judge Thompson of favoritism or inconsistency. So as Danielle stood in front of him, admitting guilt, the entire courtroom held its breath. Everyone expected the hammer to fall. They had seen it happen time and again. A confession like hers, however honest, meant little in his court. Consequences were inevitable. Mercy was rare, and so all eyes turned to the man behind the bench, waiting to see if this case would be any different. For a long moment after Danielle finished speaking, Judge Thompson said nothing. The silence in the courtroom grew heavy, charged with expectation. Most people assumed he was deciding how severe the sentence would be, calculating probation time or jail terms. But something in his face had shifted, subtle but noticeable. His stern eyes, usually unreadable, held a flicker of thought, even conflict. He leaned back slightly in his chair, then forward again, clasping his hands together. He looked at Danielle closely. "Miss Carter," he said slowly, "do you have any support? Anyone helping you with your siblings?" Danielle shook her head. "No, sir, just me." He nodded and asked a few more questions. Where did she work? How much was she making? Were the children in school? Did she ever try seeking help from local agencies or churches? His voice was no longer sharp or detached. It was measured, almost gentle, as if he wasn't just trying to gather facts, but understand her. The courtroom watched in stunned silence. It was unlike Judge Thompson to ask such questions, especially after a guilty plea. Then, to everyone's shock, he stood up. Slowly, he stepped down from the bench, something he had done only a handful of times in his career. He looked at Danielle, then spoke in a quiet but firm voice. "When I was a boy, I watched my own mother struggle. My father left. She worked 3 jobs and still couldn't afford heat in the winter. I remember nights huddled around the stove just to stay warm." There was a pause, the air thick with emotion. He didn't raise his voice or dramatize his words. He simply shared a truth he'd buried for decades. And in that moment, something changed. The judge, once feared for his cold logic, revealed the heart behind the robe. Judge Thompson returned to his seat, but the atmosphere in the courtroom was no longer the same. There was a shift, something unspoken that hung in the air. He adjusted his robe, took a moment, and then looked directly at Danielle. "This court finds you guilty, Miss Carter," he began, his tone steady. "However, sentencing is not always about punishment. It is also about purpose, growth, and the possibility of change." He glanced down at a file, then back at her. "I am placing you on supervised probation for 12 months. You will complete 100 hours of community service, but in addition, I am ordering your enrollment in the Horizon Pathways program, a non-profit that provides job training, education support, and child care assistance for struggling single parents." The room fell silent, heads turned. People exchanged confused looks, unsure if they had heard him correctly. This wasn't the harsh sentence they had expected from Judge Thompson. This was compassion measured, deliberate, and deeply human. You'll be required to check in weekly, he continued. Your progress will be monitored closely, but if you commit to this, truly commit, you'll have a real chance to rebuild, not just survive but live. Danielle stood frozen, her mouth slightly open. She hadn't prepared for this. She expected jail time or at best a fine she couldn't afford. But this, an opportunity, a second chance. She blinked, holding back tears, unsure whether to cry or speak. The courtroom remained in stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened settling in slowly. Even the court clerk paused her typing for a moment, glancing at the judge with quiet disbelief. Judge Thompson gave one final nod, his expression soft but firm. Make this count, Miss Carter. Not everyone gets this kind of moment. Within hours of the court's decision, news of Danielle Carter's case began to spread. A local reporter, who had been present in the courtroom, posted a short video clip of Judge Thompson stepping off the bench and speaking about his childhood. The video went viral almost instantly. Headlines followed: "Strict judge shows mercy," "Young woman gets chance instead of jail," and "Justice with compassion." News outlets from across the country picked up the story, and social media exploded with reactions. On talk shows and podcasts, the case became a hot topic. Some praised Judge Thompson for breaking tradition and showing empathy. "This is what justice should look like," one host said. He saw the human behind the charge. Others were more skeptical. Critics argued that rules should be applied evenly, and that emotion had no place in the courtroom. "If we let feelings guide sentencing, we weaken the law," one commentator insisted. Despite the mixed opinions, Danielle's story resonated with many. She was invited to speak on morning shows, her soft-spoken nature and sincerity winning over audiences. Viewers connected with her honesty, her struggle, and her courage to tell the truth, despite the risk. Hashtags with her name trended for days, and people began sending donations to the Horizon Pathways program in her honor. Danielle, overwhelmed but grateful, chose to stay quiet during most of the buzz. She wasn't interested in fame, she just wanted to follow through on the promise she made in court. Still, her image standing in court, head held high, became a symbol of what it meant to be given a second chance. And whether people agreed with the judge's decision or not, no one could deny that the moment had struck a nerve across the nation. The months that followed marked a quiet transformation in Danielle's life. With the support of the Horizon Pathways program, she found steady work at a local healthcare center, starting as a receptionist and gradually earning trust with her dedication and warmth. She enrolled in GED night classes and studied after putting her siblings to bed, often falling asleep with textbooks on her lap. Slowly, the weight she had carried alone began to lighten. The lights stayed on, her fridge stayed full, her siblings started to smile more. But the most unexpected part of her journey was the quiet presence of Judge Thompson. He never made it public, never sought attention, but he checked in occasionally through the program, offering advice and encouragement. He recommended books on leadership, connected her to a mentor at a local college, and sent a handwritten note when she passed her GED. Just 5 words: "You kept your promise. Proud." Danielle also began sharing her story at local schools, speaking to students about choices, resilience, and what it meant to ask for help without shame. Her words, once a source of guilt in a courtroom, became a source of strength for others. Nearly a year after her sentencing, Danielle returned to the very courtroom where her life had begun to change. But this time she didn't sit at the defendant's table. She stood at the front, invited as a guest speaker for a youth outreach program. The same judge who had once passed judgment now sat in quiet pride, listening as she spoke to a group of at-risk teens about struggle, truth, and the power of second chances. In that moment, the courtroom, that had once felt like the end of the road for Danielle, now felt like the beginning of something greater. A place not just of justice, but of hope. Late one evening, long after the courtroom had emptied, Judge Thompson sat alone in his chambers, the glow of a desk lamp casting long shadows across the walls lined with legal books and framed degrees.
He held a letter in his hands, neatly folded, written in careful handwriting. It was from Danielle. In the letter she thanked him, not for letting her go, but for seeing her. She spoke of the difference his decision had made, not just in her life, but in her siblings' lives, and in those she now mentored. She wrote of her promise to serve others, to reach out to those who feel unseen and unheard. You taught me that justice doesn't have to be cold to be strong, the letter ended. I hope to carry that same balance for. Thompson leaned back in his chair, deeply moved. For decades, he had held firm to a belief that justice must be delivered without emotion. But Danielle's case had cracked that foundation, not in a way that weakened it, but in a way that added depth and meaning. One case, one voice, had shifted something in him. He began to understand that justice could include both accountability and compassion, that sometimes the fairest verdict came with guidance, not just punishment. Weeks later, in a packed courtroom filled with students, community leaders, and former offenders, Judge Thompson introduced the final speaker for the day. Danielle stepped forward, poised and confident, a symbol of change. She spoke not as someone rescued, but as someone rebuilt. The same courtroom that once echoed with murmurs of disbelief now rang with applause. As she finished, Judge Thompson rose from his seat and joined her at the podium. No words were exchanged between them in that moment, only a nod, quiet and profound. Justice, once rigid and unforgiving, had found its human heart.